Is this a joke? Bailiff, remove this boy from my courtroom before I hold him in contempt. Judge Eleanor Whitfield sneered, her gavel echoing like a gunshot through the mahogany-paneled room, vibrating against the heavy oak of her bench. The young black man in the faded gray hoodie didn't flinch. He didn't shrink back. He just smiled a cold, calculated, utterly fearless smirk that made the heavy air in the courtroom turn instantly to ice. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he replied, his voice booming with an undeniable, ground-shaking authority that demanded absolute silence. "If you remove me, you'll be depriving my client of her legal counsel and blatantly violating the Sixth Amendment of the United States Constitution." He wasn't the defendant she assumed him to be. He was the defense, and he was about to end her career. The air inside Part 41 of the New York County Supreme Court, located deep within the historic, imposing architecture of Foley Square, was always thick with despair. It smelled of old paper, floor wax, and defeated spirits. It was an intimidating room, defined by dark oak wainscoting, vaulted ceilings, and the suffocating weight of a justice system that often felt fundamentally broken. But the true source of the room's chilling atmosphere was the woman sitting high upon the elevated bench, Judge Eleanor Whitfield. Judge Whitfield was a woman who wielded her gavel not as an instrument of blind justice, but as a weapon of personal supremacy. With severely pulled-back blonde hair, icy blue eyes, and thin designer reading glasses perched precariously on the edge of her nose, she had built a fearsome, tyrannical reputation. In the hushed whispers of the legal community, she was notoriously referred to as Maximum Whitfield, but her harshness was rarely distributed equally. The exhausted public defenders who frequented her courtroom knew the unspoken, ugly truth of Part 41. If a defendant was young, black, or brown, Judge Whitfield's verdicts were laced with an extra venomous layer of cruelty. She viewed herself as the city's ultimate uncompromising gatekeeper, single-handedly holding back what she privately, derogatorily called the decay of civilized society. It was a miserable, rainy morning, and the courtroom was packed to capacity. The gallery was a restless sea of anxious families gripping each other's hands, overworked public defenders juggling overflowing briefcases, and terrified defendants waiting for their names to be called. Judge Whitfield had already spent the first hours of her morning docket tearing into the vulnerable. She had just maliciously denied bail to a young, sobbing Hispanic mother for a minor non-violent traffic violation and sentenced a black college student to the maximum possible community service and a draconian probationary period for a first-time low-level misdemeanor. Her ego was visibly bloated. She thrived on the absolute unchecked power she held over those she deemed inferior. "Next case," she barked, not even bothering to look up from her sprawling, heavily marked docket sheet. Her voice was sharp, a grating metallic sound that demanded absolute submission. "Docket number 44-0982, the State of New York versus Wilkins." The court clerk, a tired man in a rumpled, ill-fitting suit, cleared his throat nervously. "Your Honor, this is an emergency hearing regarding an expedited eviction and criminal nuisance injunction filed by Summit Holdings, LLC, against a Mrs. Etta Wilkins." At the defendant's table sat Mrs. Etta Wilkins, an elderly black woman clutching a worn, heavily bookmarked leather Bible tight to her chest as if it were a physical shield. She looked absolutely terrified, her frail shoulders trembling uncontrollably under her faded floral cardigan. She had lived in her rent-controlled Harlem apartment for decades. It was the home where she had raised her children, where she had mourned her late husband, where her entire life's memories resided. And now, a faceless corporate landlord was trying to throw her out onto the street on entirely trumped-up charges of criminal property destruction. It was a classic, ruthless slumlord tactic to force out legacy tenants and jack up the rent. But Mrs. Wilkins lived on a fixed income and couldn't possibly afford a high-priced lawyer to fight back. The attorney representing Summit Holdings Oy LLC, a slick corporate shark named Preston Lang, smirked confidently from the plaintiff's side. His custom-tailored suit probably cost more than Mrs. Wilkins's yearly pension. He knew Judge Whitfield's reputation perfectly. He knew this was going to be an effortless, uncontested slaughter. "Is the defense ready to proceed?" Judge Whitfield asked, her tone dripping with manufactured boredom and profound irritation. "Where is the public defender? I don't have all day to sit here and wait for legal aid to get their disorganized act together. I have a schedule to maintain." Before Mrs. Wilkins could speak, before the clerk could even check the roster, the heavy brass-handled wooden double doors at the absolute back of the courtroom swung open with a resounding thud. The sudden noise echoed through the silent, oppressive room, drawing the eye of every single person present. Walking down the center aisle was a young man. He was tall and athletic, with deep, intensely observant brown eyes and short, neatly trimmed locks. But it was his attire that caused a collective audible gasp to ripple through the conservative, strictly regulated courtroom. He wasn't wearing a tailored Italian suit. He wasn't even wearing a tie. He was wearing dark-fitted jeans, impeccably clean white sneakers, and a thick zip-up heather gray hoodie. This was Darius Hale. To the untrained eye of a prejudiced observer, Darius looked like any other young man from the outer boroughs, someone who had wandered into the wrong building. But beneath the unassuming, casual exterior was a mind that had terrified tenured professors at Yale Law School. Darius possessed a flawless photographic memory, an unparalleled, almost instinctual understanding of constitutional law, and a burning righteous hatred for bullies. He had graduated high school at an exceptionally young age, breezed through his undergraduate degree in record time with perfect marks, and had just become the youngest person in the history of New York to pass the grueling uniform bar exam with a near-perfect score. But Judge Eleanor Whitfield didn't see a once-in-a-generation legal prodigy. She saw her own deep-seated prejudices walking down her aisle. She saw a stereotype. She saw a target to humiliate. "Excuse me!" Judge Whitfield's voice cracked like a vicious whip across the silent room, her eyes narrowing into venomous, hateful slits. "Who exactly do you think you are, barging into my courtroom, looking like a street loiterer? This is a court of law, young man, not a neighborhood basketball court." Darius didn't stop walking. His pace was measured, his posture impeccably straight, completely unbothered by her hostility. He exuded a quiet, terrifying calm that unsettled the room. "I apologize for the casual attire, Your Honor," Darius said, his voice surprisingly deep and resonant, easily carrying across the large room without a microphone. "I was called in on an extreme emergency basis to prevent a gross miscarriage of justice and didn't have time to retrieve my suit from the dry cleaners." Judge Whitfield scoffed, a harsh, ugly, guttural sound. "I don't care if you were called in from the dark side of the moon. You do not address me unless spoken to, and you certainly don't stroll in here dressed for a rap concert." "Bailiff," she pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at Darius. "Stop that boy immediately. Are you the defendant from the vandalism case? Because if you are, congratulations. You just earned yourself a night in lockup for contempt of court." The courtroom held its breath. The gallery froze. The drama had only just begun. The bailiff, a burly officer, who had worked the floors of Foley Square for many years and usually commanded instant compliance, moved quickly. He stepped directly into the center aisle to physically block Darius's path. "Hold it right there, kid. Don't take another step," the bailiff muttered, reaching a heavy, calloused hand out to grab Darius by the shoulder. Darius stopped gracefully, leaving exactly 2 feet of space between himself and the imposing officer. He didn't raise his hands defensively, nor did he shrink back in intimidation. He simply stood his ground, radiating an aura of absolute, immovable control that left the seasoned bailiff momentarily confused, his hand hovering awkwardly in the air. "I am not a defendant, Your Honor," Darius said clearly, looking straight past the imposing bailiff and locking eyes directly with Judge Whitfield on her elevated perch. His gaze was piercing, refusing to submit to the immense, crushing pressure she was radiating from the bench. It was the look of a hawk spotting a field mouse. Judge Whitfield's face flushed a deep, angry, mottled crimson. The veins in her neck strained against the white collar of her black robe. In her courtroom, no one talked back. No one defied her orders, and certainly not a young black man in a hoodie. Her blatant prejudice completely blinded her to the confident, rhythmic cadence of his speech and the precise, highly formal vocabulary he was effortlessly deploying. "If you aren't the vandalism defendant, then what in God's name are you doing disrupting my official proceedings?" Judge Whitfield demanded, leaning far over her massive oak desk, looking like a gargoyle ready to strike. "Are you lost? Are you looking for your assigned probation officer? Because juvenile court is down on the second floor. This is adult court, the Supreme Court, and I am rapidly losing my patience." A low collective murmur of shock rippled through the gallery behind Darius. The blatant, unapologetic racial profiling and the sheer degrading disrespect of her words made several people shift uncomfortably in their hard wooden seats. A few of the public defenders exchanged horrified glances. Preston Lang, however, let out a low, arrogant chuckle, clearly enjoying the spectacle of someone beneath him being put in their place. Mrs. Etta Wilkins, the elderly woman sitting entirely alone at the defense table, looked back at Darius with wide, terrified eyes, her knuckles white as she gripped her Bible. "I am fully aware of exactly what floor I am on, Your Honor," Darius replied smoothly, not a single microscopic tremor of fear in his voice. "And I have never had a probation officer. I am here for docket number 4-0982, the state of New York versus Wilkins." Judge Whitfield paused, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. Fighting a rising tide of irritation, she aggressively rustled her papers, looking down at the docket, then back up at Darius with supreme skepticism. "You are here for Mrs. Wilkins? What are you, her grandson? Let me make something crystal painfully clear to you, boy. Family members are not allowed to loiter past the bar. You can sit in the back of the gallery and watch quietly while I handle this eviction." "I am not her grandson," Darius said. With fluid grace, he took a deliberate step to the side, neatly bypassing the hesitant, confused bailiff. Before the man could react, he walked directly toward the small, swinging wooden gate, the bar, the sacred threshold that separated the public gallery from the highly regulated legal arena. "Hey, I said do not cross the bar," Judge Whitfield shouted, losing her temper completely. She slammed her wooden gavel down with such tremendous force that a heavy glass of water on her desk rattled dangerously. "Bailiff, detain him. Put him in cuffs. I am holding this delinquent in criminal contempt of court right now. Is this a joke? Bailiff, remove this boy from my courtroom before I hold him in contempt." Judge Whitfield sneered, her gavel echoing like a gunshot once more. The young black man in the faded hoodie didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just smiled, a cold, calculated smirk that made the air in the room turn to ice. It was the smile of someone who had just lured their opponent exactly where they wanted them. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Darius replied, his voice booming with undeniable, absolute authority as he pushed open the wooden gate with a firm hand and stepped squarely into the sacred space reserved strictly for licensed attorneys. "If you remove me, you'll be depriving my client of her legal counsel and blatantly violating the 6th Amendment of the United States Constitution." The courtroom fell into a silence so absolute, so suffocatingly profound. You could hear the distant traffic from the rainy New York streets bleeding through the thick windows. Judge Whitfield froze completely. Her gavel was suspended in midair, her mouth slightly agape. Preston Lang dropped his expensive gold-plated Mont Blanc pen onto the mahogany table with a loud clack, his jaw literally falling open. The bailiff, halfway through a desperate lunge to grab Darius from behind, stopped dead in his tracks, looking frantically between the young man in the hoodie and the furious judge in complete bewilderment. "What? What did you just say?" Judge Whitfield whispered, the sheer, staggering audacity of the statement completely short-circuiting her brain. Darius walked calmly, deliberately, to the defense table. He placed a gentle, reassuring hand on Mrs. Wilkins' trembling shoulder, offering the terrified elderly woman a warm, deeply protective smile that promised safety. Then he unzipped the front pocket of his hoodie. Judge Whitfield instinctively recoiled, her hand darting toward the hidden panic button securely mounted under her desk, a physical reaction born entirely of her own deeply ingrained racial bias. "Show me your hands!" she shrieked, her voice pitching up in panic. Darius smoothly withdrew his hand. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a sleek, custom-embossed midnight blue leather wallet. With a crisp flick of his wrist, he opened it and pulled out a heavy gold-embossed card. He placed it delicately onto the polished wood of the defense table and slid it across the surface right to the edge of the judge's elevated bench. "My name is Darius Hale, Your Honor," he announced, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable, diamond-hard confidence. "I am the senior managing partner of Hale Legal Group, and I am the legal counsel of record for Mrs. Etta Wilkins. We are ready to proceed." Judge Eleanor Whitfield stared down at the young man standing tall at the defense podium, her mind violently struggling to process the impossible information. It was absurd. It was an elaborate prank. It absolutely had to be a forged novelty document bought online. "Bring that to me," Whitfield snapped at the bailiff, her voice shaking with a potent mixture of barely suppressed rage and creeping embarrassment. The bailiff retrieved the card as if it were a live grenade and handed it up to the bench. Judge Whitfield snatched it from his hands, aggressively pushing her reading glasses up her nose. She examined the heavy premium card stock under her desk lamp. It possessed the complex microprinting of an official New York State Bar Association identification card. It bore the raised, unmistakable seal of the Appellate Division of the Supreme Court of the State of New York. And there, positioned right next to the seal, was a clear, professional photograph of the young man standing confidently in front of her, alongside his name. Darius L. Hale, Esquire. "This is a forgery," Judge Whitfield declared loudly, tossing the card back onto her desk in utter disgust. "You honestly think you can waltz into my Supreme Court with a fake ID and play dress-up as a lawyer? That is a Class D felony in this state, Mr. Hale. You are looking at a mandatory 7 years in a state penitentiary for impersonating an officer of the court." Darius sighed softly, a sound that conveyed not an ounce of fear, but rather a profound, almost pitying disappointment in the woman wearing the judicial robe. He reached into his oversized hoodie again, this time pulling out a thick, impeccably organized, leather-bound dossier, which he placed squarely on the podium. "Your Honor, if you log into the New York Unified Court System database right now and enter my attorney registration number, which is 5839201, you will find that I am a member in impeccable standing of the New York State Bar," Darius stated calmly, rattling off the 7-digit number from memory. "Furthermore, if you bother to check my educational credentials, you will note that I graduated summa cum laude from Yale Law School recently. I passed the uniform bar examination on my very first attempt with a score of 334, the highest recorded score in this district in recent memory. If you wish to maliciously delay this hearing further to verify my identity, I will gladly file an immediate formal complaint with the Judicial Conduct Commission for intentionally denying my client her right to timely counsel, based purely on your blatant, highly prejudiced assumptions about my age, race, and apparel. The word prejudiced hung in the stifling air like a lit match in a gas-filled room. It was the ultimate taboo to accuse a judge in open court, and he had done it flawlessly. Judge Whitfield's face went from crimson to stark, sickly white. Her hands trembled visibly. She frantically typed the registration number into the secure computer terminal on her desk. The gallery watched in breathless, agonizing anticipation. The silence dragged on, filled only by the aggressive clacking of her keyboard. Finally, the official state screen loaded. The New York State database confirmed it in bold green text. Status: active, standing, good. Name: Darius L. Hale, Esquire. Admission date: recent. A cold sweat broke out on her neck. She had just publicly on the record threatened to falsely arrest a fully licensed Yale-educated attorney simply because he was young, black, and wearing a hoodie. Preston Lang, the opposing counsel, quickly stood up, attempting to throw a desperate lifeline to save the judge from her agonizing public embarrassment. Your Honor, while this is highly irregular and frankly unprofessional attire, the plaintiff is entirely ready to proceed. Let's not let Mr. Hale's shocking lack of courtroom decorum delay necessary justice for my client, Summit Holdings, LLC. Judge Whitfield seized the lifeline like a drowning woman. She cleared her throat violently, trying desperately to reinflate her imposing tyrannical aura, though her hands were visibly shaking as she gripped her gavel. "Very well," she said, her voice tight and defensive. "Mr. Hale, I am officially warning you. One microscopic slip-up, one failure to follow proper procedural rules, and I will sanction you so heavily your head will spin right off your shoulders. You may technically be a lawyer on paper, but you are playing in the major leagues now, kid." "I appreciate the warning, Your Honor," Darius said, opening his dossier with a crisp, satisfying snap. His eyes were sharp, calculating, missing absolutely nothing. He wasn't intimidated. He was entirely in his element. "But I assure you, I didn't come here to play. Mr. Lang, present your motion," Judge Whitfield barked, desperate to regain control of the room. Preston Lang smoothed his expensive silk tie, puffed out his chest, and projected his voice to the gallery. "Your Honor, my client, Summit Holdings, LLC, is seeking an immediate, non-negotiable emergency eviction and a permanent injunction against the defendant, Etta Wilkins. The defendant has been recklessly running an illegal, unlicensed, and highly dangerous catering business out of her residential rent-controlled apartment. This illegal commercial operation resulted in a severe localized grease fire that caused upward of $10,000 in structural smoke and fire damage to the building. This is a crystal-clear violation of New York real property law, Section 231, and constitutes a severe criminal nuisance. She is an active, ongoing danger to the building and the other tenants, and she must be removed today." Lang smiled a greasy, smug smile directly at Darius. It was a boilerplate, highly aggressive slumlord attack. Claim the legacy tenant caused a life-threatening danger, legally bypass the agonizingly slow housing court eviction process, and use the sheer power of the Supreme Court to throw them out on the street immediately. It worked 9 times out of 10 against unrepresented tenants. A very clear and deeply concerning violation. Judge Whitfield nodded sympathetically toward Lang, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of judicial impartiality. Mr. Hale, does your client actually have a defense for nearly burning down an entire residential apartment complex, or are we wasting the court's valuable time? Darius stepped away from the podium. He didn't look down at his notes. He didn't need to. He had memorized every relevant statute, every piece of binding precedent, and every glaring fatal flaw in the plaintiff's fabricated case. My client has an excellent, insurmountable defense, Your Honor, Darius said, his voice ringing with absolute, unyielding authority. And that defense is that Mr. Lang is blatantly, provably lying to this court. Objection! Lang shouted. Instantly, his face reddening with indignation. Counsel is baselessly defaming me in open court. This is outrageous! Sustained. Judge Whitfield slammed her gavel so hard, a piece of wood chipped off the block. Mr. Hale, you will watch your tone immediately, or I will throw you out of this building right now. Sixth Amendment be damned. You do not accuse opposing counsel of perjury without facing severe consequences. I apologize, Your Honor. Let me rephrase, for the court's delicate sensibilities, Darius said, his smile razor-thin and utterly lethal. Mr. Lang is not technically lying. He is simply presenting a wholly fabricated fictional narrative that is entirely unsupported by empirical evidence, physical facts, or the established laws of the state of New York. A few people in the gallery stifled loud, genuine laughs. Judge Whitfield glared furiously into the crowd, her face twitching, but she couldn't legally object to his meticulously worded phrasing. Let's examine the plaintiff's so-called grease fire, Darius continued, pacing slowly, methodically in front of the bench, like a predator circling a trapped, wounded animal. He was commanding the room entirely, drawing every eye and every ear. Mr. Lang claims my client, an elderly woman suffering from severe documented arthritis, was somehow running a massive illegal commercial catering business. Yet, I hold here an official sworn affidavit from the New York Fire Department, specifically signed by Fire Marshal Marcus Reed of Engine Company 47, who personally inspected the site. Darius pulled a crisp, watermarked document from his dossier and handed a copy to the bailiff to deliver to the sweating judge and the suddenly nervous opposing counsel. If you bother to read Marshal Reed's official binding report, Your Honor, you will see clearly in Section 4 that the fire did absolutely not originate in Mrs. Wilkins's kitchen. In fact, her gas stove was completely turned off and entirely cold to the touch. The fire actually originated deep inside the walls, caused by severely faulty, degraded, and exposed electrical wiring that my client's landlord, Summit Holdings LLC, has been officially cited for by the city's housing inspectors on multiple documented occasions over recent years. Lang scrambled frantically to read the paper, his eyes darting across the page. He hadn't expected the young lawyer to subpoena the fire marshal's report so quickly, let alone have it perfectly authenticated. Your Honor, this report is clearly hearsay. It cannot be admitted. It is an official government record, perfectly admissible under the business records exception to the hearsay rule outlined explicitly in CPLR 4-18. Darius countered instantly, firing off the exact civil practice law and rule statute without a second thought, his mind operating like a supercomputer. Furthermore, I have officially submitted a formal motion to completely dismiss this frivolous eviction under CPLR 3211, a defense founded entirely upon irrefutable documentary evidence. The evidence clearly, undeniably, shows the landlord is 100% responsible for the structural damage, not the tenant. Judge Whitfield was visibly sweating now, dabbing her forehead with a tissue. The young lawyer wasn't just book smart. He was lethally prepared, aggressive, and incredibly fast on his feet. but she wasn't going to let him embarrass her in her own domain. "I have read your motion, Mr. Hale," Judge Whitfield sneered, waving her hand dismissively over the paperwork, as if swatting a fly. "And I am formally denying it. A fire marshal's report is merely one expert's opinion. The underlying fact remains that your client is a severe liability to this building. I am highly inclined to grant the emergency eviction to protect the lives and property of the other tenants." Darius stopped pacing instantly. He planted his feet and looked slowly up at Judge Whitfield. The quiet, polite respect he had maintained earlier entirely vanished, replaced by the terrifying, chilling intensity of an apex predator closing its jaws on its prey. "Your Honor, if you grant this eviction based on absolutely zero evidence while actively, maliciously ignoring an official FDNY mandate, you will be acting completely outside the legal bounds of your judicial discretion," Darius said, his voice dropping an octave, echoing off the mahogany walls. "Under the binding precedent set by the highest court in this state, the New York Court of Appeals in Kips Bay Towers Associates versus Israel, a landlord absolutely cannot claim criminal nuisance to evict a tenant when the landlord's own gross neglect of the warranty of habitability directly caused the dangerous condition in the first place." "I know the case law, boy," Judge Whitfield shouted, her fragile composure finally shattering into a million pieces. "I am the judge here, not you. I wear the robe. I interpret the law." "Then interpret this," Darius snapped back, reaching into the deepest part of his bag and pulling out a massive, heavy stack of financial records. "I didn't just look into the source of the fire, Your Honor. When a multi-billion-dollar real estate holding company tries to illegally evict an impoverished grandmother on an emergency basis to deliberately bypass housing court, I have to ask myself a simple question. Why the rush? What makes this specific dilapidated apartment in Harlem so incredibly valuable?" Lang practically leaped out of his chair, true panic setting in. "Objection! Relevance! Counsel is going on a massive, wildly inappropriate fishing expedition. This has nothing to do with the eviction." "Overruled!" Judge Whitfield yelled blindly, pointing a shaking finger at Lang. "Let him hang himself. Go on, Mr. Hale. Make your wildly irrelevant point so I can finalize this eviction and throw you out of my court." It was the fatal, career-ending mistake. She had actively invited him in to spring the trap. "Thank you kindly, Your Honor," Darius said, a dark glint in his eye. "I looked deeply into Summit Holdings, LLC. It's a massive, shadowy umbrella corporation. But the specific localized LLC that legally owns Mrs. Wilkins's building in Harlem is called Summit Holdings, LLC. Summit Holdings has been desperately, illegally, trying to empty this specific building for months so they can sell the completely vacant lot to a commercial mega developer for a multi-million-dollar luxury high-rise. This is standard everyday real estate business in New York," Judge Whitfield said, rolling her eyes in exaggerated annoyance. "There is absolutely nothing illegal about gentrification, Mr. Hale. Are we done here?" "No, there isn't," Darius agreed softly, the tension in the room ratcheting up to an unbearable degree. "But there is something highly federally illegal about what I found when I legally pierced the corporate veil of Summit Holdings to find its true beneficiaries." Darius walked slowly, deliberately to the bench. He placed a single, heavily redacted, incredibly damning document directly in front of Judge Whitfield. "I pulled the original incorporation documents for Summit Holdings from the Delaware Secretary of State, and then I painstakingly traced the flow of money through the shell companies from Summit to an offshore blind trust in the Cayman Islands, back to a domestic high-yield holding company right here in New York, a boutique investment firm called Whitfield Capital Group." Judge Whitfield looked down at the document. The remaining color drained from her face so fast she looked like a corpse. Her breath hitched violently in her throat, a sickening gasp echoing in the silent room. The wooden gavel slipped entirely from her trembling hand, clattering loudly onto the desk and rolling off onto the floor. And who exactly is the primary shareholder and active CEO of Whitfield Capital Group, Your Honor? Darius asked, his voice ringing with the clarity of a death knell in the dead-silent courtroom. He didn't wait for her to stammer out an answer. He turned his back to the bench and faced the gallery, looking directly at the back row, where several local investigative news reporters, whom Darius had anonymously tipped off and provided press passes to that very morning, were sitting with their notebooks out, their pens flying across the pages. The CEO of the holding company trying to illegally evict my client for a massive real estate payout, Darius announced loudly, ensuring every person in the room heard him, is a man named Gregory Whitfield, your husband, Your Honor. Absolute, unmitigated pandemonium. The courtroom erupted into total chaos. Reporters scrambled wildly over the wooden benches, pulling out their smartphones to record the meltdown, ignoring the bailiffs entirely. The gallery members gasped in shock, whispering fiercely to one another as the staggering scale of the corruption dawned on them. Preston Lang, the slick corporate lawyer, turned the color of ash. He slowly, mechanically, packed his expensive briefcase, his hands trembling uncontrollably, realizing with absolute terror that he had been unwittingly used as a disposable pawn in a massive, highly illegal judicial conflict of interest that could end in a federal RICO indictment. "Silence! Silence in my court!" Judge Whitfield screamed hysterically, banging her bare fists against the heavy oak desk, her face contorted in sheer, unadulterated panic and impotent rage. But the imposing authority had been entirely stripped from her voice. She was no longer a feared judge. She was a desperate criminal caught squarely in the blinding spotlight of her own hubris. "Your Honor," Darius said, his voice effortlessly cutting through the deafening noise, a steady, unrelenting drumbeat of pure justice. According to the binding New York Code of Judicial Conduct, specifically Canon 3E, a sitting judge must completely disqualify herself in a proceeding where the judge's spouse has a known economic interest in the subject matter. In controversy, you didn't just casually fail to recuse yourself due to an oversight. You actively, maliciously attempted to fast-track an entirely illegal eviction to financially benefit your own family's portfolio. You tried to use the sacred and trusted power of the bench to steal an impoverished grandmother's home simply to line your husband's already overflowing pockets. You little thug!" Judge Whitfield shrieked, losing all remaining semblance of professional decorum, her mask of civility entirely gone. "You hacked those sealed records! I'll have you disbarred before the sun sets. I'll have you arrested for treason against the court. I'll destroy your life." "The records are publicly available to anyone who knows exactly where to look, Judge," Darius said coldly, utterly unfazed by her frantic threats. "And I assure you, my bar license is perfectly safe. But yours is about to be permanently revoked." Darius turned back to his immaculate dossier and pulled out one final, devastatingly thick document. "Minutes before I walked through those double doors into this courtroom, I formally filed an emergency, heavily evidenced petition with the New York State Commission on Judicial Conduct, detailing this exact premeditated conflict of interest. I included the corporate charters, the fire marshal's sworn report proving you were going to knowingly rule on fabricated evidence, and certified transcripts of your highly racially biased, derogatory remarks from earlier this very morning, which conclusively establish a clear, undeniable pattern of prejudice against defendants of color." Judge Whitfield slumped heavily back into her high-backed leather chair. The fight, the arrogance, the cruelty completely drained out of her body, leaving an empty shell. She looked at the young man in the gray hoodie, finally realizing the horrifying truth. She had walked, arrogant and blind, right into a brilliantly laid, inescapable trap. Furthermore, Darius continued, his sharp eyes locking onto the terrified opposing counsel who was trying to slip away. Mr. Lang, if you do not instantly, unequivocally, withdraw this entirely fraudulent eviction petition with extreme prejudice right this second, I will file a massive civil RICO lawsuit against Summit Holdings, Whitfield Capital Group, and your specific law firm for active conspiracy to commit real estate fraud and extortion. Lang didn't hesitate for a microsecond. The plaintiff unconditionally withdraws the petition, Your Honor. With prejudice, he stammered loudly, practically raising his hands in physical surrender. He grabbed his briefcase and practically sprinted down the aisle and out of the courtroom doors, desperate to put as much distance as possible between himself and the radioactive fallout of the Whitfield family. Darius turned gently back to Mrs. Wilkins. The elderly woman had silent tears streaming freely down her deeply lined face. She reached out with a trembling, heavily arthritic hand and grabbed Darius's arm tightly. "We won, baby," she whispered, her voice fragile, hardly daring to believe the nightmare was over. Darius smiled a genuine, incredibly warm smile that completely transformed his face, melting away the intimidating legal shark and revealing the compassionate young man beneath. "We won, Mrs. Wilkins. You get to keep your home. Nobody is ever going to touch your apartment again. You're safe." He looked back up at the elevated bench one last time. Judge Whitfield was staring blankly at the dark oak wall, completely catatonic as her prestigious career, her fearsome reputation, and likely her very freedom crumbled into dust around her in real time. "Court is adjourned," Darius declared, casually stepping into the role of authority she had completely forfeited. He gently helped Mrs. Wilkins to her feet, offered her his arm, and guided her slowly down the center aisle, walking right past the stunned, motionless bailiff. The packed gallery parted for him like the Red Sea, breaking into spontaneous, thunderous applause and cheers that echoed all the way out into the halls of Foley Square. The brilliant young man in the hoodie had just single-handedly dethroned a tyrant. The resulting fallout was catastrophic, breathtakingly swift, and completely unmerciful. Hard karma had finally come to collect its massive debt on Judge Eleanor Whitfield, and it spared nothing. That very day, the explosive story had broken on every single major news network in New York City. The high-definition video of the courtroom exchange, secretly recorded by a brave gallery member and instantly leaked to the press, went massively viral, racking up millions of views in hours. It was the absolute perfect media storm. A notoriously racist, deeply corrupt judge, a heartless, illegal eviction of an innocent elderly grandmother, and a brilliant, entirely unassuming young black man in a hoodie who systematically dismantled the entire corrupt system with surgical, undeniable precision. The New York State Commission on Judicial Conduct, terrified of the massive public outcry, did not take the airtight allegations lightly. Swiftly, Judge Whitfield was officially suspended without pay, pending a massive, sweeping investigation. When the federal investigators aggressively dug into her past rulings and financial statements, they didn't just find a single conflict of interest. They uncovered a massive, festering web of systemic corruption. Throughout her long career on the bench, Whitfield had routinely, maliciously, handed down maximum sentences to young minorities, while quietly dismissing cases, suppressing evidence, or handing out incredibly light probation to defendants whose wealthy families were secretly connected to her husband's sprawling real estate and investment firms. In the months that followed, following highly publicized hearings, Eleanor Whitfield was formally stripped of her judicial robes in disgrace and permanently disbarred by the state of New York, never to practice law again. But the karma didn't stop there. The federal authorities caught wind of the story. Dozens of black SUVs swarmed the glass-fronted offices of Whitfield Capital Group. The FBI raided the firm, carrying out hundreds of boxes of hard drives that contained the secrets of a rigged empire. Gregory Whitfield was swiftly indicted by a grand jury on 27 federal charges, including massive real estate fraud, money laundering, wire fraud, and extortion. Facing decades in federal prison, his financial empire collapsed overnight into bankruptcy. In a desperate, pathetic attempt to save herself from heavy accessory charges, Eleanor Whitfield was forced into a deeply humiliating plea deal, officially and forever branding the once-feared Maximum Whitfield as a convicted felon. As for Mrs. Etta Wilkins, she never had to worry about rent or slumlords ever again. Following the very public exposure of Summit Holdings Hoodie LLC's illegal terrorizing tactics, the city seized the entire building under eminent domain laws due to the landlord's severe criminal negligence and massive structural violations. The building was heavily renovated and turned into a permanent protected tenant-owned cooperative, and Mrs. Wilkins was given the absolute title to her apartment, free and clear, for the rest of her life. And then there was Darius Hale. The remarkably young Yale prodigy became an overnight living legend in the legal world. Every major corporate law firm in Manhattan, Chicago, and Los Angeles aggressively offered him millions of dollars in starting salary to join their elite ranks. They promised him massive corner offices overlooking the Manhattan skyline, bespoke Italian suits, limitless expense accounts, and endless wealth. Darius turned every single one of them down without a second thought. Instead, he took the modest but substantial legal fees he won from a massive fast-tracked civil settlement against Summit Holdings, LLC, and opened a small, deeply welcoming storefront law office right in the heart of Harlem, just 2 short blocks from Mrs. Wilkins's apartment. He proudly painted Hale Legal Group on the front glass. He dedicated his entire practice strictly to civil rights litigation, aggressive tenant protection against slumlords, and high-level criminal defense for the underprivileged, who had been forgotten by the system. Almost immediately, he became the ultimate nightmare of corrupt landlords, lazy, predatory prosecutors, and biased, power-hungry judges across the entire state of New York. On his very first official day at his new Harlem office, the bell above the door jingled. A young, visibly terrified teenager walked in, clutching a trumped-up citation for a crime he clearly didn't commit, looking like he expected to be thrown in jail any second. He looked around the modest office, then looked at Darius, who was sitting comfortably behind a simple desk, wearing his signature faded gray hoodie. Are you the lawyer they were talking about on the news?" the kid asked skeptically, clutching his citation. Darius smiled, that same sharp, immensely confident glint in his deep brown eyes that had broken a judge weeks earlier. He leaned forward, resting his strong hands on a pristine, heavily tabbed copy of the New York State Legal Code. "I am," Darius replied warmly, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Sit down. Let's go level the playing field." Wow. What an absolutely incredible, satisfying story of absolute karma. Judge Whitfield thought her prestigious title, her gavel, and her deep-seated privilege gave her the unquestionable right to trample on the vulnerable and bend the law to her will. But she picked the absolutely wrong young man in the wrong hoodie. Darius Hale proved brilliantly that extreme preparation, profound intelligence, and an unyielding, fearless demand for true justice will always completely outsmart arrogance, prejudice, and corruption. True power in this world doesn't come from wearing a black robe or banging a wooden gavel. It comes from deeply knowing the law and bravely using it as a shield to protect those who can't protect themselves. If you loved watching this arrogant, racist, deeply corrupt judge get completely dismantled and destroyed by a genius young attorney in open court, make sure you smash that like button right now. It really helps the channel grow and tells the algorithm you want more. Share this video with your friends, family, and anyone who loves a massive, highly satisfying dose of instant karma. And absolutely don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our daily, highly dramatic justice stories. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What exactly would you have done if you were in Darius's shoes standing up to that judge? See you guys in the next video.